We all understand that 300 years ago, the treaty helped to end a very terrible war, but it also fostered a growth in transatlantic slavery. And then 150 years ago, Netherlands abolishes slavery as part of a great movement to end legal slavery. Wonderful. And on this double anniversary, we arrive at this very unique historical moment. It's unique because slavery is actually very diminished in the world. It's a very small part of our current global society in raw numerical terms. It's in fact such a small part of our global economy that we can say that it's standing on the edge of its own extinction if we decide to put just enough effort into it to push it over the brink into that extinction, if we choose to take the steps to make sure it comes to an end. And so, Your Highness, allow me to make and suggest some provisions that you might propose as king that will help establish a global movement that will eradicate slavery in the same way that we have eradicated through global health campaigns diseases like smallpox. 300 years ago, that French negotiator, as French negotiators do, they're not always as polite as they might be, taunted the people of the Netherlands and said, in his bon mot, that this is a treaty de vous, chez nous, sans vous, that those negotiations for the treaty were held about you and in your country, but without you. Well, Your Highness, this new Treaty of Utrecht will be de nous, chez nous, avec nous, and reach much further, out to the entire planet, as well it should. It's a global world. Now, we all understand that this was a treaty with a split personality. It was both historic and haphazard. It brought peace and it brought war. For some, it granted freedom. For others, it brought slavery. It was, in the vocabulary of biological evolution, what's known as a punctuated equilibrium. And if you don't study biology, that's okay. But understand that, we know that evolution, in the biological sense, is not any kind of smooth flow. It's not a smooth flow upward to some better and better fit and happy place in one's environment. Instead, it's an adaptation that will normally achieve at some point an equilibrium, a balance, a place where that particular organism is in the right balance with its environment, and it'll stay there for a while. And you can think about sharks, for example. For more than 1 million years, they've been in this wonderful equilibrium in the oceans. They've changed almost in no way whatsoever. It's actually only today, with global warming and CO2 immersions in the sea, that sharks are beginning to have a problem with their equilibrium. Well, 300 years ago, there was a political equilibrium, and it was one of almost standing conflict. But nations were changing, national economies, global economies were changing, and for a moment there was a stasis of interests where they found a pivot, a point of change, a punctuation of an equilibrium that marked the shift from one state, and I don't mean nation state, I mean a kind of conceptual state, a political state, an economic state, to another. The wars that had ravaged Europe and the Netherlands cooled. The new sharks, the English, began to happily flap their tails and sink their teeth into the Spanish possessions in the Caribbean, and even were able to begin to initiate such violent actions as that wonderfully named historical moment, the War of Jenkins' Ear, which was actually named after the ear of a man named Jenkins that was cut off by a Spanish captain. It brought good and it brought bad. And what I have to say, one of the things that I'm very happy about, which was both painful and yet ultimately triumphant, was the expulsion of the Arcadians from Newfoundland and the sending of them to Louisiana. Now, I actually learned as a child in America, we had to learn the poem Evangeline. There stands the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks, bearded in moss and with garments green, indistinct in the twilight, as the poor Arcadian girl was being dragged away to a ship to be sent off to this crazy place called Louisiana into an exile. But had there not been that, there would be no crawfish étouffée. There would be no okra gumbo. There would be no of this wonderful blending of French cuisine and African cuisine, which has given us Cajun cooking, Cajun music, and so forth. I feel terrible about the pain that the Arcadians went through to become the Cajuns. I feel very happy as a Southerner that the Cajuns came to be, just for the food alone, not to mention the culture. Okay, that's a digression, but I'm very partial to my gumbo. It was only to be expected, though, that violence would follow the assignment of the asiento granted to England by Spain, the right to trade in slaves in the Spanish New World possessions. After all, slavery is rooted and founded in violence. It does not occur without violence. Slavery spreads violence like pollen, not just to those who are enslaved, but really throughout the societies and communities where slavery exists. The armed leap into that slave trade that were allowed by the provisions of that Treaty of Utrecht brought in its wake the enslavement of millions and the deaths of a great many of those enslaved. We all understand that. But the thing about evolution, about punctuated equilibrium, is that it's very difficult to predict where it will go, and it is rarely all bad or all good. Had there been no assignment of the asiento to the English, would that special minority of English citizens begun the critical rethinking and redefining of the activity of slavery? Because I think we have to be clear, human rights come about not by law. They come about not by treaties or by edicts. They only come about when a sufficient number of people redefine an action or an activity as being morally repugnant or damaging to the common good. Slavery had been seen for thousands of years as an inevitability, as an economic or business activity that was crucial to national economies, sanctioned by God, or simply part of the human existence. In the wake of the expansion of the slave trade after 1713, first a trickle and then a stream of people came to see slavery in a new way, not just as business as usual, but as a moral problem, as an action that damaged the slaveholder and the slave, as a denial of the divine that exists within every soul, within every person. And that began the first of the four great anti-slavery movements. The one that began in 1787 in London, 12 people sat around a table and said, we will begin the effort to bring the slave trade to an end. It was an insane thing to do. If people would call it mad if it were happening today in the same scale. I think it's important to remember that economic historians would tell us that the size of the slave trade in 1787 was about the same size in relative terms as the global automotive industry is today. It would be as if I said to you all, let's pull our chairs into a circle and begin planning tonight how we will bring the global automotive trade to an end. It would be that kind of scale of endeavor. And yet they did it. They sat down, and incredibly, particularly if you've ever worked in campaigning organizations, the idea that they achieved a law that brought at least the trade to an end within the British Empire in 20 years is phenomenal. It's probably one of the most powerful campaigns that have ever existed in the history of human rights campaigning or any other kinds of campaigning. It also invented something, the NGO. This was the first organization that I can determine historically that was ever non-denominational, non-political, based on a human rights campaigning point and so forth. In a sense, they invented of what we now call NGOs, which have led to all the other fluorescence of those types of organizations. They were followed by the second great large-scale anti-slavery movement, the one in the United States that built up to the time of the Civil War. One of the, if the English campaigns, the British campaigns, which spread widely, were very successful, in some ways we have to say the American campaign was not so successful because they achieved emancipation only through war. I don't think that's the way we want any of our campaigning organizations to achieve what they want to occur, is to precipitate or help to precipitate a large-scale war. Then there was a third great campaign, the one that few people remember, but I'm in a group of historians, so we all remember the Congo slavery campaign that begins at the end of the 19th century, involves hundreds of thousands of supporters in many countries around the world, has big celebrities, Broadway stars. Mark Twain, the author, is one of the celebrity spokespeople. It was an enormous campaign at the time, part of all the newspapers, and yet somehow that one has slipped away from, for the most part, our memory. Yet it was also the campaign that introduced, well, two things that are, I think, very noteworthy. One was the use of documentary photography to clearly demonstrate the range of and the scale of the genocide and the slavery that was happening in the Congo, almost introducing the concept of the documentary photographers who go out and solve problems through presenting those images. And it was also about that campaign that an African-American journalist, and about what he saw in the Congo, first used the term, "This," he said in a letter back, "is a crime against humanity." He coined the phrase, crime against humanity, to describe the enslavement of somewhere between 6 and 10 million people in the Congo. And we know that the death toll was equally, almost that high as well. Then there's an interesting period of lackadaisical motion, and we begin the fourth great anti-slavery movement about 15 years ago. We're actually sitting at this moment in one of the opening and initial parts of the overture of what it will, we hope, will be the last anti-slavery movement. But it's the fourth. We're now in the fourth global anti-slavery movement, just at its beginning, and we are hoping that this will not be the campaign that ends it in a particular country like the Congo, or ends it in ends the law that allows slavery to exist, but actually ends slavery for good. Now, can we do that? Yeah, I think we can. Here's a map of slavery. You can see where, you know, the red countries are where the most slavery, the pink countries less, and so forth. And we know that around the world, there's no country without slavery. I used to say, oh, there's no slavery, I think, maybe in Iceland. And then I met a member of the Icelandic parliament who said, I don't know why you're saying that. We've got slavery too. So every country in the world has slavery. And our best estimate at the moment is about 27 million people caught up in slavery around the world. But we can eradicate it. We believe very clearly that we can eradicate it. Now, why? Why would I say that? Well, in large part because of the way we've come to understand what that means. For one thing, let me share this.
Lively discussion guaranteed here, as always, as we get macro and talk commodities. Continuing here in the studio with our guest, Michael O'Donoghue, Head of Commodities at Four Continents Capital Management. And we're also joined by Brent Lawson from Lawson Frisk Securities.
Happy to be here.
Good to have you with us, Brent. Now, gentlemen, Brent, where's your money going this year?
Well, Daphne, we've been going short on gas and oil recently and casting our net just a little bit wider. We really like the human being story a lot. If you look at a long-term chart, prices are at historical lows, and yet global demand for forced labor is still real strong. So that's a scenario that we think we should be capitalizing on.
Michael, what's your take on the people story? Are you interested?
Well, definitely. Non-voluntary labour's greatest advantage as an asset is the endless supply. We're not about to run out of people. No other commodity has that.
Daphne, if I may draw your attention to one thing, that is that private equity has been sniffing around, and that tells me that this market is about to explode. Africans and Indians, as usual, South Americans, and Eastern Europeans in particular are on our buy list.
Interesting. Michael, bottom line, what's your recommend?
We're recommending to our clients a buy and hold strategy. There's no need to play the market. There's a lot of vulnerable people out there. It's very exciting.
Exciting stuff indeed. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Don't get too outraged. It's a spoof. It's a spoof. Occasionally when I show that to students, they actually jump up and yell at the screen. But I wanted to share that with you in part because it's the evening and we should have a little entertainment even though we're talking about slavery, but also because it's a phenomenal illustration of a reality that if, in fact, Bloomberg Channel was able to broadcast what's going on in the global slave economy today, this is precisely what they would be saying. And they'd be saying it in particular because of one of the key things that I want to tell you about contemporary slavery, which is one of the few things that makes the slavery of today different to the slavery of the past. And that is simply that the price of human beings, the acquisition cost of human beings has collapsed. That through most of human history, slaves have been expensive. Through most of human history, slaves have been expensive. I worked with a number of other economic historians for several years, and we began to work all the way back into the most ancient records, building an index that had to do with oxen and agricultural labor and the price of land and so forth to determine the price of slaves over time. And obviously, this is rough measures, but if you equate it into contemporary sums, and particularly if you use those points in the past when we have really good price data, as it were, acquisition costs, like Rome, Greece, and then the American Deep South, in contemporary funds, you would be saying a slave in the past cost something like $40,000 to $50,000 on average over time. Now, you can see this particularly well in the place where I come from, the Deep South in the United States, where you go back to 1850 and a slave, an average agricultural worker, a 19-year-old young man would cost about $1,000 in 1850 dollars. But you could also buy a house for $1,000 in 1850 in the Deep South, and you could buy a couple hundred acres of land, or you could buy usually something like 4 oxen at that time, the main sort of, think tractor or truck, right? But today, all around the world, where both Free the Slaves works and where I've done work, we haven't been able to find anything like that. The price of a human being varies from as little as the equivalent of $10 or $20 in places like India and the places where poverty is very high, up to, in the United States or in Western Europe, into low thousands of dollars. But only the low thousands, not 50,000, only the low thousands. There are a lot of reasons for this. It has in part to do with the population boom, up to 7 billion people on the planet, the fact that there is simply a very large pool of vulnerable, enslavable people, or people who are desperate enough to be lured into the situation. And it means that there's a large, it's a supply and demand. There's a great supply of enslavable people around the world. That's a terrible thing to say. And I want to say that, you know, this is where that term came from, one of the things that I had originally postulated in that book and then later worked out with a series of other social scientists, was that many of the people who are enslaved today, in fact, most of the people who are enslaved today, are not worth replacing. I mean, they're not worth caring for, as slaves had been in the past. So it's not unusual to have people who are in slavery used and then broken or ill and then just discarded rather than protected in any way. Let me show you a couple of those people. These little boys are now free. Let me tell you that they're now free, but we work with these children in Nepal. They're used to haul very large stones up and down the mountains in Nepal where they don't have roads. They're enslaved as young children. They're lured away from their families. Some are kidnapped. Some are convinced that they actually are going to have a good job. And it's a very dangerous work. When they are going along cliffs and they're carrying these weights that are as heavier than their own bodies, sometimes they fall into a ravine. Sometimes they fall and break their leg. When that happens, they're just left. They are completely disposable. We're expanding that work in Nepal with that group of children, and we're having real success there, but like everything else, we need more resources to make more of that happen. Now, that's the really ugly part that I have to point to when I talk to you about contemporary slavery. And I don't want to talk about just the ugly parts about contemporary slavery. That's enough to know that people are inexpensive, they're disposable, that it's happening around the world. I want to talk more because I'm still addressing the king here. I'm still talking to him about where we need to go with this, that I want to explain that there are reasons why we can actually bring this to an end now with just a little bit of help from people like the king or even more powerful people like Bill Gates, say. The first thing, and the reason I say more is less, is because if you take 27 million people and say this is the number of people we believe to be in slavery around the world, and you take that as a proportion of 7 billion people on the planet, the only thing that you can conclude is that in fact this is the smallest proportion of the global population to ever be in slavery. So the tiniest fraction of the world population in slavery is today, as far as I can tell, throughout human history. And likewise, we estimate that those slaves generate into the global economy about $40 or $50 billion a year. The ILO has a number of around 55. I've had a number but it's all around that number, around 40 to 50, maybe $60 billion a year. But I appreciate billions are big numbers for most of us, but in the global economy, which is something like 15 to 20 trillion, it's a drop in the ocean. In other words, the economic part of the slave production in the global economy is so small that it's below trivial. It's simply not important. Today, the low proportion of the population and the low proportion of the global economy means that this is not an issue that was faced by abolitionists in the past. Let me say that a slightly different way. What did those previous campaigners have to fight? One, there were laws that supported slavery. Not now. There's a law against slavery in every country. There were major institutions like churches that said we have a justification and rationalization why slavery is okay, why God says it's okay, why this philosophy, our race theories say it's okay. That doesn't exist in the same way. There is absolutely discrimination. There is absolutely prejudice and racism, which still comes into slavery, but not at the institutional levels that happened in the past. And thirdly, those abolitionists and campaigners, especially of the 18th century and early 19th century, were confronting something the size of the global automotive industry of today. They were confronting an economic activity that was enormous. It was a foundation upon which the economies of many nations was based. Today, it's trivial. No large industry is based on slavery or relies on slavery. No large industry does. No national economy is based on slavery. If we removed slavery somehow, if we could turn it off like that tomorrow, you wouldn't see the price of anything go up. You wouldn't see any business, industry, or national economy collapse. You would see criminal economies and criminal businesses collapse, but not any of the large corporations that we know of. Now, the thing is, we don't have the obstacles that we had in the past. But we also have now learned how to get people out of slavery. We know how to do that. We've got about 20 years now of using modern techniques of monitoring and evaluation of intervention projects, doing log frames and outcome mapping, and all those things that the development agencies do when they try to change situations on the ground. And we've applied that to anti-slavery work. And I'll mention a couple. We know that in hereditary forms of slavery, which exist in North and West Africa and in South Asia for millions of people, that there are community organizing models, which then establish what are called community vigilance committees, which then arrive at small communities which have been in slavery, being slave-free and slave-proof. Literally slave-proof. It's almost impossible to take any of the people back to slavery. We know that when people have been lured and recruited and brought into slavery through human trafficking mechanisms, that there are direct intervention and rescue methods which can help preserve their safety and the safety of the liberators and take them into processes of liberation and reintegration that are effective. It's more expensive than the community organizing model, but it's not horrifically expensive. We know that when there's been trafficking into labor, particularly agricultural labor, we've seen amazing models in South America of mobile enforcement police squads accompanied by a mobile judge, which is, I think, a wonderful concept. A judge who rides with the police, shows up and makes pronouncements as a labor judge, not a criminal judge, but as a labor judge, and orders immediate compensation to those people who have been enslaved, allowing them the resources to get home to their families and then also to prepare legal cases if they choose to. All those things work. They've now worked for thousands of people who have come out of slavery. We can point to those. We've done even longitudinal studies of how this plays itself out. And we've also learned that while those liberation techniques are successful, that none of it works unless you also understand that the point of liberation is only step number one, that it must be followed by a period of very careful, planned rehabilitation, care, and reintegration. Otherwise, it all comes unglued. And when I say that, I mean a very carefully prepared package which allows people to recover physically and mentally, but especially to achieve basic education, to achieve what they need for economic autonomy, training, tools, often some simple capital investment, that they learn about their own rights and their role as a citizen. And it's harder to measure, but also they reclaim a sense of dignity. Now, just as we have learned in the last 20 years how to bring people up to the point of liberation, we've also now learned how to take them through that process. We know it takes 2 to 3 years. We know that it takes 2 to 3 years. And certainly 10 and 15 years ago, one of the things that was very tough about what people were doing who were very concerned about human trafficking was that they were rescuing people, but then not knowing what to do with them. And in this country and many countries around the world, people who were rescued, I keep using the inverted commas there, from slavery, were then finding themselves wandering back or being drawn straight back into that situation again. Now, this all leads to a couple of questions, like, how much does this cost? Now, this is another thing that we know, and this is one of the reasons why I'm bringing this to the king and to some of the other people in the Netherlands. Because that family that you can see there in India was in a hereditary slavery, something that was called hereditary collateral debt bondage slavery. It's a specific kind of debt bondage in which somewhere back 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 generations, his great-great-grandfather put up his family as collateral against a debt, so that the family and all the work that they did was held as collateral against an original loan, usually of no more than 10 or 20 euros worth. And then the slaveholder holds that family and owns everything that they do and can do what he likes with them until that loan is repaid, which they can't repay because he owns everything that they do. It's a wonderful catch-22 if you're a slaveholder. It responds to a community organizing model. And this picture of dad, son, and his 2 children was taken just after liberation in that village, and that's why they look a little puzzled and a little upset. If I had more time, I would show you the pictures from a year later where you see all these children grown and in different clothes, and the dad who's now used his investment of his little capital injection. I thought he was going to open a bicycle shop. Instead, he formed a theater company, which I thought was fantastic because he taught me something, the young man there. He wouldn't tell me. I was saying to him, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And he said, I don't want to talk about it. My dream is too big. And I thought, he's going to open a bike shop or something like that. And then he turned around and he started a theater company that tours during the Indian wedding season and puts on Bollywood musicals that have slavery liberation themes, and does a booming business and can, run his farm in the off months and then run this theater. And I realized inside every person in slavery is this Hollywood star, Bollywood star waiting to come. Well, not everyone, but the point is, it's when people come out of slavery you actually open up this phenomenal creativity and this phenomenal truth, which is that real person as opposed to that enslaved person. But the cost of bringing that family out of slavery, because it was part of a much larger community where we had been working for some time, and you sort of amortize the cost across the population of that community, was about 150 euros. The child in Ghana who was lured and trafficked into the fishing industry at Lake Volta required finding that individual child, bringing them out, helping them into the rehabilitation school, which is a separate school, rehabilitation center for children. Costs are higher in Ghana, something like 400 euros. You go to the United States, the US government allocates about $30,000, $30,000, $40,000 in there to support a person who has been enslaved in the United States for about 3 years afterwards. And it's supposed to pay for everything, and it doesn't. They usually end up having to choose between, do I get the mental and physical help I need, or do I pay the lawyer that I need to pay, or what, right? So it doesn't necessarily work out. But most of the people in the world who are in slavery do not live in the United States. They do not live in the expensive countries. They live in those places where, on average, if you average it across the globe, the average cost of bringing someone out of slavery around the world is between $400 and $500, something like 400 euros. Now, what does that mean when you multiply it by 27 million? Esther, you're the mathematician. That's right, 10.6 billion. Now, I just thought I'd point out that that's exactly the net worth of Charlene de Carvalho Heineken, right? That's precisely the quoted net worth of Ms. Heineken. That's a Dutch-generated single individual who has enough money in her bank account to end slavery on the planet Earth. Okay, will it really cost 10.6 billion to end slavery on the planet Earth? No, I think it's probably going to be 15 to 20, because it's going to take 20 to 25 years to actually, if we had the resources, it would still take 20 to 25 years, because we have to find the people and train them how to get people out of slavery and so forth. But the point is, in real terms, when you have individuals with that much in their back pocket, we're actually beginning to talk trivia again. We're talking about numbers that are actually so small. I mean, I've got a million examples of this, because I always look it up. It's what Americans spend on blue jeans in a year. It's less than the cost of the Big Dig tunnel under the river in Boston, the one that leaks, and they're going to have to go and fix it all again. I mean, it's what the city of Seattle is going to spend on its tram system. This is not the kind of money that we couldn't find if we wanted to. The Netherlands, Your Highness, is thinking to cut its order. This is today. This is the news of today. Is thinking to cut its order for new fighter planes that they buy at $85 million each. They're thinking to cut it from 85 to 68, a savings of about 1.5 billion. And I think everyone applauds the idea that fewer fighter planes in the world is probably a good thing. But, Your Highness, really consider, if the Netherlands wanted to dramatically increase freedom in the world, as well as generate new and dynamic economic growth in the developing world, and create a truly new world, a world that after 5,000 years with slavery became a world without slavery, if it simply decided the world and the Netherlands doesn't need any more fighter planes right now, the savings just from not buying the fighter planes would be enough to pay for half of all the world and all the people in slavery to come to freedom. This beautiful, smart little country could again achieve, Your Highness, a place of global leadership just by not buying its fighter planes that it's so often attained in history in the past. And beginning in 2015, there will be a global fund for the eradication of slavery. This is a new thing, but there are several significant investors operating at the billion dollar level who have said it's time to do for slavery what Bill Gates has done with malaria. So it wouldn't be just the Netherlands working alone, they would be working with others as well. Now, what would this new treaty say? What would this new treaty say? I think first that Netherlands would first clean up its own backyard. It would say, we'll do whatever is necessary to make this country what will probably be the first country on the planet Earth to become a slave-free country. A country where slavery is so rare, so unusual, that it would be like cannibalism is when it pops up in the news. I don't think we can ever stop all human beings doing bad things, but we could take it to that point. And the Netherlands is certainly a country that could achieve a freedom from slavery and slave-proof the country, where it became part of every citizen of the Netherlands' understanding of their role as citizens, to know what slavery looks like, and to know what to do if they see it, and to know what they think about how they could be. And then once the Netherlands was a slave-free country, it could convene and cooperate, which is something you do very well, convening and cooperating. This is a good example. In fact, you could be in charge of that part. To help other countries become slave-free and slave-proof, and especially for those countries where slavery is a greater challenge, to get behind those proven and effective methods of liberation and reintegration, scaling them up until slavery becomes extinct. And then also doing what the Netherlands also does very well, operating within the international agencies. There are so many things it could do within the international agencies. I'll just point to one thing, for example. No, I'll point to two. One, work hard within those members of the Security Council who actually make all the decisions in the non-democratic United Nations. But secondly, to say, we have a convention against slavery, a very clear convention in the United Nations against slavery. In fact, we have like 3 or 4, but we have no inspectorate. We have a convention on biological weapons with an inspectorate. We have a convention on health and on nuclear weapons that have inspectorates. But we don't have an inspectorate for our conventions on slavery. Why not? Why not have a UN team that is authorized to look around the world and say, there's slavery there. We have to think about what we want to do about that. Now, did I finish here? Oh, yeah, I need to tell you one more thing about that, and then I'll wrap up. A moment ago, and I should have hit this slide a moment ago, when I talked about when the Netherlands begins to help lead the others, and I said the words about achieving economic development in the developing world, dramatic economic development. You see, one of the things that we've been learning from the longitudinal research that we've been doing with several hundred communities that have been coming from starting in slavery and ending in freedom is that when you end slavery, you create an economic spiral upwards. That slavery is in fact a drag on the economy at the local level. And that when people come out of slavery and begin to work for themselves and are able to provide for their own children, this is not a big surprise in some ways. When they are able to work for their own children, to provide for themselves, they begin to work very hard. And they begin to focus their intensity. And with a little bit of aid in a rehabilitation, reintegration package, it spirals up very dramatically. And it doesn't just generate, some slaveholders in those areas have in fact discovered that they make better incomes when they've lost their slaves than when they had them, because they find that their other businesses, like shops, suddenly turn over much more money. We also find that there's a freedom dividend in diminished disease, there's a diminishment in sexual assault, in other crimes, there's a diminishment in corruption, all of those things that can create the difficulties that occur around the world and suppress economic activity. You know, if the only reason that we got interested in bringing slavery to an end was because it's good for business, we would be heartless bastards. But if we want to end slavery because it's the right thing to do, and it turns out to be good for the economy, I'm kind of happy about that. What we don't want to do is have a botched emancipation. And I point to this just because in the United States, at the end of that Civil War, when legal slavery came to an end, 4 million people were lifted up out of that slavery, and then they were dumped. No access, real access to education, to political participation, to credit, constant discrimination, violence, prejudice. It was a botched emancipation. They went from slavery into second and third class citizenship. Some of them went actually back into slavery, into the peonage system. It was not the way to bring people out of slavery. When we began to do the work 10, 15 years ago in Free the Slaves, and we said, if we're going to be serious about large-scale emancipation, let's study the places where it's gone right and it's gone wrong. And we came away saying, never on our watch will people come out of slavery and become third-class citizens. So we also have to be careful and safeguard against that. Now, Your Highness, we're now a global people. And we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to live in a world with slavery? If we don't take action, really, it's just giving up. And it's letting other people jerk the strings that tie us to slavery. There are many kinds of exploitation in the world. There are many kinds of violence. There are many kinds of injustice that could all take up our time. But it's also true that slavery is important because it's exploitation and violence and injustice all rolled together in one of its most potent forms. If there is a fundamental violation of our humanity that I think all of us want to reject, it's slavery. I think if there's a basic truth that virtually every human being can agree on, it's that really slavery should be brought to an end. And so, Your Highness, I want to ask this question. What good is your and our economic and political power if we can't use it to end slavery? Especially it turns out that it's so good for the world that we live in very positive ways. And really, Your Highness, if we can't end slavery, if we can't make that choice, if we can't do that, how can we say that we're free? Thank you so much.
I will talk to you this evening a bit about this backyard of King Willem Alexander. We were just listening to the proposal of cleaning your own backyard, and what we see in the Netherlands, that in order to clean the backyard we have to know what's there. And one of the problems on the issue of modern slavery in the Netherlands is that we do not know that it's happening. As Fair Work, we did an opinion poll 1.5 years ago, and then it's sorted out that everybody in the Netherlands knows that modern slavery is happening in the world. But when you ask them, do you think it happens in the Netherlands, only 8.4% of the people says, yes, I think it happens in the Netherlands. So it means that only 1 out of 10 people in the Netherlands really realizes that this kind of situations does happen in the Netherlands. And what we think as Fair Work is that that is one of our first goals in our work, to make people aware about this problem, and that it's not only happening in forced prostitution, that it's happening in different sectors also in the Netherlands. So I wanted to show you a very small film that we did on the case of a Philippine au pair here in the Netherlands, and she tells a bit of what she has been through.
Me too.
I didn't expect that it will happen to my life. If I could turn the time, I will not go to that place to work. My family didn't have enough food. That's the reason why I have decided to go abroad. When I was in the airplane going to Holland, I was so excited. I joined the ambassador's family to work in Holland as a babysitter. For the first time I work with them, they are okay, and it seems that they are all nice. When I woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning, I have to work, but then I have a rest, but it's only 1 hour, something like that. For the 24 hours, I'm working the whole night and the whole day for €145 a month. The ambassador was very strict to me. If she saw me that I'm looking at outside the window, she's calling on me, "I'll go inside." I think she didn't want me to see anybody outside. I don't know why. I've never enjoyed myself. I don't have any freedom. Yeah, 2 hours, but I'm only stuck inside the house. They didn't let me go out. And then if I look at the window, and then if there is somebody that I saw, for example, in the garden, it makes me feel happy because I feel that I am still part of the world because I cannot go out. Sometimes I was deciding to jump in the window just to end my life. And then I was thinking about my children, what will happen to them? And then it was so funny because when I look up at the window, it was so, it's not so high. So okay, I really have to be strong. The ambassador wants to cut my hair for the baby, but I couldn't accept it because in our religion, we will not allow to cut our hair. That is also one of the reasons for me to decide to escape from them. I think it was 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning. The daughter of the ambassador, she thinks that I'm going to the comfort room, to the toilet. We escape. Oh my God, I hope that we will not be caught. When I escape out from that situation, I feel more stronger and I realize that there's still hope in my life. I do this interview anonymously because I'm afraid the ambassador will hurt my family. I want to prevent it to other people. There's no victim again.
Yeah, so this is just one example of things that happen today in the Netherlands. And one of the complicating factors in this case is that the slavery situation happened in a diplomat's house, and diplomatic immunity makes it difficult to really persecute this exploiter. But well, that is one of the issues we try to work on also at an international level, to see what you can do also in this kind of situations. What I wanted to show you a bit this evening is what is happening in the Netherlands, and that it's still important, as Kevin is also saying, to work on it, to see it, to know that it's happening, to act on it, and then see if we can make this country a slave-free country, as was mentioned before. That would be the big ambition of our organization, and hopefully of many more people in the country, and hopefully King Willem-Alexander will support also this mission.
Or Miss Heineken.
Or Miss Heineken will allow part of her budget to be focused on this. Just very shortly, what was already said in the introduction, Fair Work is our organization, was founded in 1999 by two Dutch organizations, Oxfam Novib and Humanities. And it was on an initiative of Oxfam Novib, who was working already in many developing countries on the issue of trafficking in women, slavery, etc. And they said, well, as a Dutch organization, isn't it something that is happening in the Netherlands as well? And in case, yes, shouldn't we do something about it? And our main aim is really, well, you can put it in the big ambition of a slave-free Netherlands, but it's on preventing and combating modern slavery in the Netherlands. In the first years of our existence, we very much used the term trafficking in persons, as that is the legal term that is in our criminal code. When we did this opinion poll 1.5 years ago, we also asked people, what do you think the issue of trafficking is, and what do you think modern slavery is? And then we saw that there's a big difference in what people put under these both terms. And then from then we started using much more the term of modern slavery, as the answers of the Dutch public were much more in line with the real situation of exploitation, of bad conditions, on dependency, on not being able to escape. And on the issue of trafficking, it was much more confused with smuggling, with only focusing on prostitution, with only focusing on the transport part. So that is why, as an organization, we see that in awareness-raising campaigns and in information, it's much more useful to use the term modern slavery. In the Netherlands, the last years, well, as you might have known, the Dutch government does put the issue of trafficking/modern slavery as one of the priorities, at least in its policy. So there have been a lot of cases in the first years, mainly on prostitution, and now also the last years in other sectors. So when you see there are many different sectors where slavery cases do occur. So it's on agriculture. There has been a big case of mushroom picking lately in a mushroom picking farm. There are cases from food industry. There are cases, as we saw now, on au pairs or domestic work. Cases of slavery practices in restaurants. There was a case on a Chinese cook lately, and also in a Chinese massage salon, where it was about labor exploitation, sometimes combined with sexual exploitation, and the issue that is much more known, the issue of forced prostitution. What you can see in all these cases is that it is very much about the combination of different factors, bad or no payment, very bad work conditions, and the main criteria of slavery, where it comes to, are you able to escape from the situation? And there is the thing that in many cases people do not consider them in the possibility to escape, although they are not locked behind the door in many cases, but they have their passports taken away, they have the fear of threats or retaliations, they have the situation of their family in their home country, and that all, they have for example, the threat of being undocumented in this country. So all these things can be factors that make them unable to escape out of their situation. As you can see, well, very shortly, there has been some media attention the last years, and that, in our opinion, helps a lot to make the issue known. We were talking about figures. And figures are always a very important issue when it comes to this kind of themes. Kevin mentioned the figure of 27 million people in slavery worldwide. We use a recent research from the ILO that has been publishing figures on forced labor in Europe, and we have translated that to the Dutch situation, and then it would be on 30,000 cases of slavery in the Netherlands. I was just discussing this with Kevin over dinner, and he thought it would be a very high figure. I told him that when I talk to people in the field, like trade unions and police officers, they really do not consider it a strange figure. So that means that we welcome any figure that is much more researched still. But at this moment, what we see in the Netherlands, there's only one more or less hard figure, which is the registration, the number of registered victims and potential victims of trafficking in the Netherlands, and that's a figure on 1,700 people last year. And, well, it must be somewhere there between 1,700 and 30,000 in the Netherlands. And, well, there it shows immediately the big problem is that it's not visible. That it's not visible where people are, it's not visible where you can find them. There are a lot of efforts put in place in order to make the problem visible, but there's still a lot of work to be done. What you see is that if you look at the group of people in slavery in the Netherlands, then you can see that it's a very heterogeneous group. It's not only about non-EU nationals, for example. It's about EU citizens. It's about Dutch nationals. You all know probably the stories of Dutch young girls lured into prostitution. And so there's a big variety of people that can be vulnerable and that can be put into slavery in the Netherlands. So both on country of origin, on age, on educational level, on gender. It's about women, but it's also about men. In the experience that we have had in the Netherlands, we think that it's very important to continue working on the issue, and we have identified some initial aspects that we think need to improve in the Netherlands in order to get to this big ambition of a slavery-free country. So one is that what we think that what is needed is a human rights-based approach, in the sense that policy should be focused on the people that are in the situation and not only on the perpetrators who have been doing it. Because at this moment it's very much on the perpetrator, and that means that if there's not enough evidence to start an investigation, the person that has been declaring is not considered a victim of slavery anymore. So we think that it's very important to put the people in the center and then start from there. At this moment, it's only the police in the Netherlands who can identify a person as a victim of slavery. And we think that it's very important that there will be a much broader team of professionals who would be in the possibility to identify such situations. Capacity building of all stakeholders, what you see in different stakeholders, for example, at the municipal level, then you see that there are people looking at illegal housing practices, etc., but they do not have the knowledge on the issue of modern slavery, so they do not take into account a lot of signals that are there when they do their job that also can indicate there's a situation of slavery there. So that means that that we still together miss a lot of signals and miss a lot of information on the issue. We also think that it's important to involve employers and trade unions on the issue. As we saw also now, it is on economics and an economic issue. So it's very important to involve employers on this positive part. Why don't we really end and eradicate slavery now? Because it's possible. And on the side of the victims, what we see, it's very important to focus on the issue of compensation. In the Netherlands now, it's very difficult to really have people compensated for unpaid wages, for other kinds of indemnization. And we think it's very important to focus more on that part. Then just small part on what you can do as general public. What has struck me very much in several of the stories of people we work with is that it's many times like in a very small things. So one of the au pairs that we work with, she said, it was just a woman who talked to me on the schoolyard. And she said, do you want a cup of tea? You look a bit pale. And then she said, oh, there was someone that was interested in me as a person. And then, bit by bit, I found the strength to stand up against my situation. Another person said, well, I was just wandering in the street, and then there was someone who said, come over to my house. Maybe you can fresh up a bit. So these like very small things can make a difference for this specific person. So if we talk about what you can do as a random person living your life in the Netherlands, is to have a social and open attitude, and to be aware that it can happen, so that you can be a bit keep your eyes open to signals. And what we see is that many times it's very important to just enter in contact. It's not that you have to really organize a raid by the police or something. Sometimes just this word and this nice way of treating the other person can make the difference. So that, well, in very short, it's what I wanted to tell you now. And I really think that one of the questions that we should ask ourselves as well, we now know from Kevin that we can end slavery, and we have to ask ourselves, do we really want to end slavery? And if we do say yes to that, let's act together, and hopefully we will be able to reach it. Thank you.
Thanks for very wonderful presentations. I really like both. But it keeps me wondering, why do we have slavery in the first place? I mean, if economically it's not really relevant in terms of what it contributes to economy, even in terms of what it will cost us to get rid of it. But why are we still having slavery? And can we really hope for taking away slavery with buying them free, buying the slaves free? Why is it so that even today, after so many bad experiences, after having learned so much about what it is, what it means, slavery, is that a case that we have more profound reasons? And could it be that slavery will be something that will come up again and again and again?
Let me first sort of dispose of this concept of buying people out of slavery. Slavery is illegal in every country. If you begin to buy people out of slavery, you actually are compensating and rewarding people who are enslaving people. It's a little bit like paying a burglar to get your television back after your home has been raided and robbed. It's not the way to bring slavery to an end by giving money to people who would then possibly use it to enslave other people. So even though it seems like it sometimes starts to be a good idea, if you look into it carefully, it doesn't usually work, and it's usually not the way to go. You know, I think I said, I think people will continue to sometimes do bad things, but you can create situations as people understand more about how to operationalize and work with human rights, that certain crimes do diminish. And that this crime, because we haven't been paying attention to it, because we don't see it, because it's operating in a hidden economy, in a criminal economy, means that we simply have not matched the resources to the level of the crime to the point that we can suppress it. And the simple answer is, you can suppress this crime if you put resources to it. It's an easier crime to suppress than drug dealing. We know that. We know that once you get people out of slavery and you work with them, it becomes very, very difficult to re-enslave them. And that you can also work with people who have not been enslaved but who are vulnerable and create a situation where they become very difficult to enslave. But your first question was simply was about, you know, if it's not economically part of the global economy, why does it continue? Well, the answer is because it works economically at the grassroots level if you're a criminal. And the key there is when you're in a situation where the rule of law does not sufficiently protect people. So if you want to see slavery just blossom, if you want to see it just explode, go someplace where the rule of law has collapsed in the situation, say, of armed conflict. Go to the eastern provinces of Congo, or Bosnia 15 years ago, or Sierra Leone 10 years ago. You know, when there's large-scale conflict or local conflict, and the rule of law collapses. And when the rule of law collapses, anyone who has a weapon can pretty much make the rules for the people around them. And that's exactly what happens in the worst situation. That's the worst situation, where slavery easily operates because there is no protection of the rule of law. As you move along a continuum in which you increase the power of the rule of law, then what you find is that the countries which have high levels of corruption, but not actual violence or war, are the countries which have the highest levels of slavery. And that as you diminish corruption, you begin to diminish the amount of slavery as well. Because really you judge the rule of law not by how well it protects rich people, because the rich people always get protected. It's the poor people that you have to judge the rule of law by. And when you can guarantee that, then you can begin to think about the end of this slavery. But you know, in some ways, it's not flourishing because it's part of a rich part of the big economy. It's really what it is because we've been pretending it's not there. And when I started working on this issue, people said to me, I don't know why you're doing that because everyone knows it doesn't exist. Now at least we're to the point where people are beginning to understand that it does exist. Yeah.
Well, I think most is already said, and what you see, for example, in the Netherlands with also the economic crisis, but also a certain political climate, which has like some factors that influence also on this issue, and it makes certain people vulnerable to certain situations, and that makes others exploiting the vulnerability of others. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much both for your talks. I actually have two questions and they are related. What is the definition of slavery? And does it depend on the country that you're talking about? Because I can imagine that part of that definition has something to do with criteria concerning the level of welfare, and obviously those are different in different countries.
The definitional question is a very important one and a very interesting one because there are in fact a series of current definitions, both in the laws and in the international laws, and they don't necessarily agree. And then there are another series of definitions which are used by organizations and by social scientists. I've primarily used a working definition that can be used within social scientific investigation, which is not necessarily what a legal definition would be. But there is I'm sorry to answer around, and I'm actually reducing a sort of 3,000-page discussion of the definitions of slavery down to 2 paragraphs. But the good news is that there's actually beginning to be consensus, international consensus, around the original League of Nations, United Nations, 1926 definition of slavery, because it can both be operationalized within social science and applied within courts of law. And that definition is a little cumbersome. It's a little awkward because it bases itself on the laws of property. And it doesn't say that a person must be legal property. So it's not saying that a slave is legal property. It says that a person is a slave if they can be treated as if they were property. And then there's a whole subset of the law of property which describes what you can do with your property. And you can exploit it, you can destroy it, you can consume it, you can loan it, you can mortgage it, you can sell it. There's a long list. But fundamentally, not every single one of those apply to human beings, but certainly exploitation, consumption, destruction, and so forth, all do. And all of those can be operationalized in social science. So it does not vary from country to country. This is a universal human right. And we have to define it as such. And we can't vary it from place to place, either because of culture or because of political provision for people who are in that situation. In my mind, I will tell you that a slave is a person who is under the complete control of another person. Violence is used to maintain that control. And the nature of that violent control, the aims of it, is exploitation. That's the kind of tight little definition that we use. And our rule of thumb when we're in the field and we're saying, are these people, is this woman in slavery? Well, the first thing we ask is, can she walk away, even if it's into a worse situation? Because one of the things about freedom that we don't think about much is that we have in freedom the ability to ruin our own lives, right? That's one of the great things about freedom. You can screw up your own life. And some of us have tried that. We've tried to do it in different ways, drugs, whatever, right? But a person in slavery cannot even do that, right? A person in slavery does not have the sufficient free will to even hurt themselves in a way, and to walk away or to make bad choices and so forth, unless they want to suffer the violence of the slaveholder. Right? So I hope that's helpful. And I'm looking forward to the day when we really have this perfect, clear definition that everyone agrees on. It's going to make life a lot easier.
I was wondering if you could, both of you actually, talk a bit more about the link between memory and reconciliation and contemporary slavery. And what I mean is is memory and reconciliation a necessity in order to recognize contemporary slavery, or is it in fact something that can be used in order to say, well, there is no slavery anymore because that's been done with? How is that something that is important to recognize and talk about contemporary slavery? And I'd be very interested in the Dutch connection there as well, specifically.
If I understand well the question, you're talking about the past and the present in that sense? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, how necessary is it to recognize the past of the slavery past of your nation in order to see its presence and future?
Okay. Yeah, it's a difficult topic in the sense that it's a very polemic topic as well, especially in the Netherlands at this moment. Looking back at 150 years of abolition of slavery, what I think is important is that it's not about comparing what is worse or what is less bad, in the sense that I think it's important to focus on the issue of freedom, and I think it's important to focus on the issue of human rights, where both parts also come together, that really basic human rights are violated. They were violated then, and they are still violated nowadays. And I think it's important to, for us, for example, to use the term slavery and to make a link back in order to see that this is an issue and a problem that we really should not want in our nowadays life and in nowadays society. So in that sense, well, I see a bit there the connection and the value of looking back. And what I see different is that there's a whole connection of the past into the situation of how do you say it, descendants of slaves from the past, which is another topic that I think should be addressed, but is different from the issue of modern slavery now. So.
A lot has been said in today's meetings about memory, and particularly the different forms that memory has taken. And when we remember abolition, but we don't necessarily remember the slavery before the abolition. You know, we celebrate one and commemorate one, but not the other. In many ways, the memory of slavery is a significant problem for those who wish to abolish slavery today, because it's a faulty memory. The truth of it is that there has never been a day in any recorded human history when there has not been slavery. It didn't stop. It altered in places in terms of its prevalence. It went up or down. It increased in some places and not in others, and so forth. But it's never ended, and it's not really terribly different. The types of slavery that you can document in the past, you can find exact equivalents today. Virtually all of them. Virtually all of them. And when I say in the past, I don't mean just 100 years ago. I mean 1,000 years ago. You can find almost identical forms of enslavement today. So in many ways, it's simply a continuum which has been with us for a very long time. The good news is that it's diminished in relative terms to the global population. The good news is it's diminished. You know, the Roman Empire ran on slavery the way America runs on oil. We don't have anything like that today, but we still have the slavery. So in some ways, we have to confront that memory, the memory that says, didn't we do a great job when we ended slavery, and remind people that, no, actually we didn't. I'm going to say something personal about that, just because I'm a Quaker, and Quakers are a confused religious body, right? We're woolly and confused and a little uncertain about where we fit in the world, but we pat ourselves on the back and say, but didn't we do a great job on slavery? And I've had to realize, no, we didn't. We didn't finish the job. We didn't finish the job. And that's important to a Quaker, because we take long views. You know, 350 years ago, we said we're going to work until peace occurs. We're going to work for peace until we get peace. 350 years later, we're still working for peace. About 300 years ago, we said we're going to do something to end slavery. Then we dropped the ball, right? We blew it. And so I feel very personally about this memory that we have to confront. Now, the other part of your question was about reconciliation. And I'll be very brief to say, almost no one is talking about reconciliation between slaveholders and ex-slaves today. But I also understand that if we are going to learn from the past and from the botched emancipation that happened in the United States, but happens in other countries today, until we understand how to build a Truth and Reconciliation Commission around the issue of freed slaves today, we'll have a harder time bringing slavery to an end. And I've written a tiny bit about how we might think through reconciliation, but most people who think about slavery today simply want to use a kind of Hollywood approach, which is find the slaveholders, beat them up, throw them in the jail, kill them, set free the cute people who are in slavery, not worried about the other people, and then we'll go ahead from there, you know.
Oh, I have the mic already, so I'll start. I'll first direct my question towards Professor Bales. You mentioned the rehabilitation and reintegration of freed slaves, and then you mentioned the carefully prepared package. And what I was wondering is, when people have been going through this carefully prepared package, how do they return back to the society they came from? For example, in the case where the family has sold a little girl to some people for money, for example, can they return back to that society where they came from? And then my second question is, you also mentioned you should not create second-class or third-class citizens after you freed them. Is that possible after those 2 or 3 years which you mentioned within that carefully thought-through package, and then how? And then I think it's the third question. Do these people who are freed, I don't know if you know that, but do they feel as if they belong, whether it's the society they return to or the new society they are in? Once they are freed and they go through this carefully prepared package, do they feel like they belong somewhere?
Briefly, as possible. Well, the answer is yes, no, no, no. The quick answer is yes and no. I mean, the first question is that sometimes it's possible, sometimes it's not, in terms of what you were suggesting. But for the most part, it is, if you're very careful about how you do the work. And then in terms of the reintegration process, do they feel accepted? Do they feel citizens? Do they have a new life? You know, can they be accepted? Do they feel they belong? And the answer is, again, yes and no. For the most part, yes, if you do the job well. But you're right, if they come from a place where they've been sold from a family, literally, that doesn't happen very often, but it does happen sometimes, where children are sold because there is a denigration, a kind of devaluing of girls in some communities, in some cultures, to the point that they'll sell children off. It's very hard for them to go back, and unless they're willing to go back as adults and try to change it. And in that case, you just have to find a new place, a place where they will belong, and they will be able to have the education and the productivity that gives them a life of purpose. And that's tough, but you know, we know that you can live past that in the same way that any one of us who might have had a tough childhood, you know, with who knows what, a parent who goes to prison or someone who's abusive or whatever, you can grow past it. But with enough support, it can work. That's the short answer, sorry.
Thank you.
You can look at my book, Ending Slavery. It has a lot in there about that process.
Thank you. Second last question.
Last question.
I will not ask do my questions. Just an observation. Wouldn't it be great, Rosie, if we would get one of the big newspapers in Holland to actually publish this letter of Kevin? And maybe with a reference to the king's father, Prince Claus, maybe that could even entice him to actually answer. Yes, I'd like to volunteer to make that happen.
Well, two things. What are the politics of race in the new form of contemporary slavery, which I will not call modern slavery, because modern slavery already happened. That's one thing. And the second thing, go back to Lydia's remarks. If it's not what we call for economic reason, should we not expand the notion of economy? That it's true, it's not about plantation today, and it's not about slave ship, but there is nonetheless something around the economy of the body, even in what we call domestic slavery or whatever, or debt slavery, whatever the name we give, in the trafficking in the body as commodity, and thus that the question of economy is not just, plantation, trafficking in bodies for plantation, but a certain economy. Because even in a family, as someone as a slave doing domestic work is not a form of, economy, or sexual exploitation, or children exploitation, or whatever. So this question of, economic benefits, are they just, do they have to be justified in terms of like a benefit of this multinational or company, or should we expand also the notion of economic benefits?
Well, the answer is no, it does extend beyond sheer monetary economic gain. And in fact, I want to point for a moment to, as a great example, is domestic, particularly young women who are enslaved as domestic workers. It happens across Western Europe, it happens across North America. And one of the things that you observe when you see this is that, yes, the person who has enslaved this person as a domestic may be saving a tiny amount of money in terms of what they would have paid someone to clean and cook or whatever and care for children. It's very small. But what you actually observe, and something that I've been working to understand more and more, is you actually see this very often, a powerless individual, very often the woman who inhabits the house, who feels very powerless in her role, begins to spiral into the abuse of power, both sexual and physical, when for the first time in her life she has, and sometimes a man as well, total power over another person, complete and total power over an enslaved individual. And you have middle-class women who could be thought of as housewives spiraling down into torture, rape, abuse at levels that are just incomprehensible. And it's all about power and abuse. It's also worth saying that it's important to understand that while there has been in the past this separation of human trafficking into sexual exploitation primarily of women, we have to understand that all women in slavery are sexually assaulted. Factories, farms, it doesn't matter. If you're a woman in slavery, you will be raped. And that's just the way it is. And on top of that is the fact that it actually means that the enslavement of women in some ways paradoxically exceeds the totality of control, which is part of the enslavement of men. Men are enslaved in the totality of their body, but it's the exterior of their body and it's their labor. Women are enslaved, and it's the control of the totality of their exterior body and their labor, but it's also the control of their interior. So that it involves sexual assault, but it also involves impregnation, and sometimes even the trafficking of organs and all of that sort of thing. So it's a paradox to be able to say it's about the complete control, but the enslavement of women is a more complete control than the enslavement of men. I'll leave you with a paradox.
And on that feminist paradoxical ending, I'm going to close this astonishing session with the homework to write up in Dutch the open letter to the new king. Join me in thanking this bright, brave, and provocative panel. Thank you so much.